Yes, I was asked to talk in 8 minutes about all the safety and security risks of nuclear power. So the big picture, and here I'm going to talk about really focusing on the potentially catastrophic impacts of nuclear power, as opposed to Cindy's presentation, which focused primarily on routine releases. I'm looking at the disasters. And it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that nuclear energy poses significant safety and security risks. For safety, you just have to look at Fukushima and the Japanese disaster in 2011 that led to the meltdown of three reactors. In the US, just based on the nuclear industry's own assessments, which they call probabilistic risk assessments, if you look at summing up that probability, there's about a 1% chance per year that a reactor in the United States will undergo a Fukushima type meltdown. If you take into account not only the internal events, that is a pipe break or some spontaneous equipment failure, and external events, meaning natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, et cetera. And of course, it's very hard to actually predict the frequency and the severity of those events, especially as climate change continues to progress, and trying to predict the weather becomes even more treacherous. But it is clear that those impacts are going to increase over time due to the more severe climate impacts or more severe weather impacts of climate change. Now, quite apart from safety, which is an accident, you also have to worry about security. And it shouldn't be a surprise either that if a tornado or an earthquake can lead to a meltdown, so can an intentionally created event by either a subnational terrorist group or a state. Radiological terrorism is the term that's used in this context for sabotaging a reactor. And studies have shown that a well-trained, well-equipped terrorist group, if they are not prevented from access to a nuclear reactor, can destroy enough equipment to essentially lead to a meltdown within hours. So for that reason, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires nuclear plants to have armed response forces that are equipped with semi-automatic weapons and other means to deter or prevent a terrorist attack. Without that protection, they would be very vulnerable. Also, you have to worry about theft of nuclear weapons usable materials, and nuclear power, of course, is a dual-use technology. The same facilities used to make fuel and to produce electricity for civil purposes can be misused to make materials for nuclear weapons. And for countries that reprocess spent fuel, and that means to take spent nuclear fuel that's been irradiated in a reactor and subjected to chemical processing to extract plutonium. And as we heard from Arjun, anytime you irradiate uranium fuel, you're going to get plutonium. That separate plutonium poses a theft risk because only 10 pounds or less of plutonium is stolen, could be used in a crude nuclear weapon. So France and Japan are countries that reprocess spent nuclear fuel as part of their civilian fuel cycle. And the US has not done so much in the past, but it's on the verge of potentially changing its policies and going forward with reprocessing spent fuel. And the current Department of Energy is advocating for this very strongly at this point. Then the other aspect of security, it's not the subnational attacks that you have to worry about, but it's finding a nuclear reactor in the middle of a war zone. And if you look at the front pages, you know that in Ukraine, this is a very live issue. Despite all the people expressing surprise, how could a situation occur where a reactor complex like Zaporizhzhia is suddenly the subject of a military, a fight between two powers over possession of it, involving combat and explosives, and the affecting the offsite power system multiple times, bringing this reactor potentially close to a severe accident. People express surprise, although it's completely obvious that anytime you have a facility like that, even if you think it's in a peaceful environment, circumstances could change. And unfortunately, because that has not really been anticipated, nuclear power plants are not protected against military attack. And finally, there's nuclear proliferation, and that is the misuse of facilities by a nation. The misuse of civil facilities to produce materials for nuclear weapons, for instance, North Korea and possibly Iran. Next slide, please. So given that litany of problems, the industry has essentially fixated on the small modular reactor as potentially the solution to all nuclear power's problems. So if you look at promotional materials for different reactor types, they claim they're passively safe, that they don't need any human intervention, even if you lose all electrical power, like what happened in Fukushima. And if something does happen, if there is core damage, these reactors are small, so there's less radioactive material that can go into the environment. Some are claimed to be proliferation resistant and would be too hard to use for military purposes. Next slide, please. And so there's you can just scroll down there. So there's a whole litany of concepts, they went too far, right, that are in range, there's a range of stages of development for these different technologies. Some of them are close to light water reactors, the current fleet, like NuScale, but others use coolants other than water. And these are exotic. They've only had limited to no operating experience around the world. There's a long history of failures with regard to many of these technologies, yet the industry has trotted them out again as potentially a way forward to improve nuclear power. And in my view, what's going on here is that the industry simply feels like they have to show the public that they're doing something different than what's going on now, because the current situation with regard to nuclear power, essentially stagnation in the United States for decades, is not a pretty picture. And so the only way they can convince the public they're relevant is to say we're doing something different, something innovative, something to attract the interests of investors and Silicon Valley disruptors, et cetera. But it's 99% promotional baloney. I'm not going to go through all these different types here, but I did write a report last year that went into a lot of detail about why so many of the claims about these reactors are false. Next slide, please. So as we heard from Cindy, in one example, the SMR vendors are claiming that because their reactors have so many safety advantages, that they merit weaker regulation in a whole range of ways. Next slide, please. And this is also true with security. If the claim is that the reactors are so safe that no matter what happens to them, that you can't harm the public, well, that means that even if terrorists try to attack the reactor, the public couldn't be harmed either. So why do you need all that expensive security? And again, the NRC is buying this argument. Next slide, please. You can skip this one. Time.
And it's okay if we go over time a little bit.
Okay,
I think
right.
we're expecting to go over time.
Okay, all right.
No.
So a lot of these alternative reactors pose potentially greater proliferation and terrorism risks than even the current fleet. And that's because many of them use different types of fuels than the low enriched uranium that operating plants use in this country. And that includes using uranium with a greater level of enrichment than the current fleet, which is often called HALEU. This is still considered low enriched uranium as opposed to the highly enriched uranium, which is used in nuclear weapons. But it turns out HALEU is not is potentially usable in nuclear weapons, certain types of designs, even though it's not as efficient as using highly enriched uranium. Then even some of the vendors claim that they are going to use plutonium or they're going to reprocess spent fuel and burn up the plutonium that they extract. And some of them, such as molten salt fueled reactors, have a liquid fuel, and they actually would undergo reprocessing as the reactor's operating. So you'd have to have a chemical plant right next to the nuclear reactor to remove certain isotopes from the fuel. And I could go on all day about what a bad idea these reactors are, but anyway. And the scary thing is that a lot of these are being rushed into development and potentially even deployment before the international community and the International Atomic Energy Agency and other bodies that are responsible for safeguarding against proliferation and terrorism have methods to actually protect these reactors from either being misused by states or being used by, or the materials being used by terrorists. A lot of the methods are simply not developed yet, yet these reactors may start being deployed around the world before those methods are even available. Next slide, please. So it seems, no matter what you think of nuclear power in general, you would think that if you're going to build more nuclear plants, that they should meet a higher standard of safety than the current fleet. I mean, that's just basic logic. I mean, you look at any industry and presumably they promote improvement as you come up with new models. We know it doesn't always happen, but you think the goal would be to make things safer. But the NRC, as a point of pride, does not require new reactors to be safer than existing reactors. In fact, that's enshrined in their policy on advanced reactors. And the reason for this fundamentally is the fear that if they required new reactors to be safer, then people would start questioning the operating fleet and its safety. And they don't want to do that. So paradoxically, you end up with a regulatory system that does not reward safer reactors, but in fact ensures that things are not going to improve. Next slide. And so one consequence of that policy is that even if you had a reactor that on paper had safety features that looks better, and frankly, some small reactors in theory could be safer than large reactors because you have a system that just generates heat, a smaller amount of heat, and the core is smaller, and you can envision it's easier to remove that heat from the reactor. So even if you lose cooling for some period of time, you'd have more margin. But the problem is that even if they look good on paper, the industry is anxious to cut costs for reasons you'll hear about in the next talk, I believe. And to do that, to slash their capital and their operating costs, they want to cut corners in every possible way to allow these reactors to be deployed as cheaply as possible. And there's a fancy term that the NRC is using, is writing into its new regulation for licensing new reactors. It's called Part 53, and that's application of, I can't even read it, safety margin right, to operational flexibilities. And this is essentially saying that you are, if you show that your design on paper looks safer than the existing fleet, you can cut corners in other ways. For instance, you can site the reactor in a densely populated urban area, which is not prohibited now, but is discouraged under NRC's guidance, but they've just changed that policy to allow the siting of reactors in densely populated urban areas. As we heard, you could eliminate all off-site radiological emergency planning. You could also reduce or eliminate all your security officers. You could reduce or even eliminate operators or reduce their qualifications. And all this is going on in the scheme that's being developed at the NRC. You could also say you don't need a containment structure. That's the typically reinforced concrete steel-lined structure that's supposed to protect the environment in the event of a core melt. But the industry is arguing that you don't need a physical containment. You can have what's called a functional containment. In other words, you show on paper that things aren't going to leak out, even if you don't have that physical structure, and then you don't need one anymore. You also, you don't need highly reliable backup electrical power. The idea is that even if you don't have electrical power, the reactor will just shut itself down. Again, really not technically valid. Next slide, please. And small isn't always safer. So even if you think, a small reactor somewhere is going to have less radioactive material, you don't have to worry about it as much. Of course, there are a lot of contingencies. For instance, you don't know how many modules are actually going to be on the site. If you replace one large reactor with the equivalent power rating of small reactors, you don't have a smaller plant. And then you have to worry about how they interact during an accident. In other words, is one going to lead to a cascading failure on the others? We saw that something similar to that at Fukushima. Also, it depends on these other measures that the defense in depth that's required or characteristic of the current fleet, whether or not it's good enough, it's still there. For instance, a containment or locating the reactor in a relatively unpopulated area. If you remove these measures, then you may really counteract any benefits from the safety of the design. And then other failure modes that will take out multiple units at once. And then there's spent fuel storage. So even if you have a small reactor, if the fuel's accumulating over decades, then you're going to have a large amount of radioactive material on site no matter what. Next slide, please. So you can skip that. So getting to NuScale, just briefly, again, this is sort of the poster child for the small modular reactor, where the developer claims that because it's so safe, it doesn't need any of those fancy safety features that we saw on the previous slide. They're really the vanguard. They've been the kind of intellectual leader in dismantling the current safety regulation scheme for nuclear power, and for that I despise them, I have to say. Next slide, please. You can skip that. So and NuScale, despite all their claims of how safe they are, if you actually look at the numbers, and I'm not going to go through this, but it turns out it's not really safe, that safe, even by their own numbers. And the reason for that is because the risk, according to their own study, the most serious risk is not that one of the reactor modules is going to experience a core melt by itself, but it's that when you're refueling, you drop one of the modules, it punctures the swimming pool where they're all sitting, and you have essentially a multiple module meltdown. And the risk of that is actually a lot higher just from this cask drop incident. And if you look at the numbers, it turns out that a NuScale plant would actually have a higher risk of core damage than a single passive larger light water reactor like the so-called AP600. So it's really a fiction that these reactors are inherently safer. Next slide, please. And on top of that, the claims of passive safety are misleading. The idea that the reactor will safely shut down even if you lose all electrical power and you don't need operators to do anything, that it turns out that's a total lie. And in fact, there's a process that could occur if you had operation of the emergency core cooling system at NuScale, where the boron, which is needed in the coolant water to suppress the chain reaction, would actually become concentrated and be depleted in the coolant. And that means that you could actually have the reactor becoming critical again, that is starting up, even if you thought it was shut down. And that actually could lead to a rapid increase in power, which an NRC staff member who dissented from the NuScale design certification claim would increase the risk significantly. Next slide, please. And we also learned that NuScale seismic design is flawed, and another NRC senior staff member wrote a dissent where it's pretty clear, you can't really argue with these words. The design of the NuScale reactor building is incomplete with unknown seismic margin and is likely unsafe. That's NRC staff. Of course, the management managed to make his concerns go away, and they did certify the reactor. The final certification was in July. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I went over this. So, but as we heard, the certification that the NRC issued only applies to a module that's 50 megawatts, and NuScale's already abandoned that size. The larger reactor, that is 50% larger than what was certified, is going to have to go through a separate approval process. And NuScale thinks that it's going to be easy, but I don't, at least if the NRC is going to be serious about addressing the issue, because again, the heat load, the power generation of this reactor is critical for these safety systems. And you can't just increase that by 50% and expect that you're going to have the same margin of safety. Now, they are increasing some of the, they're making some adjustments, but probably not to the extent that you would need to maintain that same level of safety margin. And so I think if the NRC approaches this honestly, it's not going to be an easy task for them to get this additional standard design approval. And I think that's all I have, and I apologize for talking too long. Thank you.